Hi, welcome back. My name is Eleanor and I'm going to be talking about another poetry book. This one has just come out. It is called O by Zeina Hashem Beck. I started reading it yesterday and I was going to do a vlog. I had a relatively free day and I thought I would vlog myself reading it throughout the day and then sort of do a summary at the end. That did not work out. I found that perhaps other people can do that, but I couldn't. It was too exhausting to try to push myself through an entire book, especially as I hadn't ever read anything by Zeina Hashem Beck in her linguistic world, her world of imagination. It's completely new to me. That being said, I did pretty much work through the first half of the book, a lot of it while sitting at a secondhand bookstore cafe. And at one point, I was still in the first section of the book. The book is divided into 4 sections. At one point, there were 2 young women who started looking at the poetry section, which was just behind me by chance. And they had, before this, been talking very happily and excitedly about all the books that they were finding. And they were each carrying a batch of books that they were going to buy. And they noticed the sign that says poetry. And one of them says to the other, "I guess I read some poetry." And the other young woman says, "Really?" And the first one responds, "No, actually, I'd never read a whole book of poetry. Ugh." And they walk on. And at the time, I felt very superior to them because there I was reading the first part of Zeina Hashem Beck's brand new book, and I was really entranced by it. By the end of the day, I could relate to them. I really could. It became a slog, and I didn't think it was fair to the book or the poet. So I took a break, and then around midday today, when I had a bit of time, I went back to the book, reread it, and continued to finish it. And I have several competing thoughts, competing reactions. And I think that really speaks to something that those young women, probably without realizing it, had themselves experienced when maybe they were forced to read an entire book of poetry. You really are never reading poems that the poet specifically wrote for a book. They are usually books that have been written many, many years previously, all the way up to the present, to the moment of publication, I suppose. And they may be very different in subject matter, tone, form, etc. And it makes for a harrowing read if you're a very, very serious reader. I sometimes take poetry way too seriously, and I found myself so enamored with the first part of the book and much of the second book. But once I reached the third and fourth, even though I took a break and even though I took the pressure off and I told myself, I would do the review whenever I felt like it, and it's not really a review, it's more a discussion, and it's more for me than for anybody else, because I was, really curious about Zeina Hashem Beck. And I must say that I feel that there's a marked difference between generally the first half of the book and the second. Now, before I go into that, I just wanted to mention a few really interesting and unusual things that's happened right at the start of the book. It starts with an explanation by the poet herself about the bilingual poems that she calls duets, which is absolutely delightful. there is some Arabic poetry that's incorporated into English poems that sometimes stands opposite, in parallel, or in a kind of mirroring or echoing. And I really found that excited me very much. I unfortunately don't know Arabic, but from what Hashem Beck wrote, it seemed like it would be a wonderful experience, which it was and is. And then there was a note from Zeina Hashem, who is, I looked her up, another poet. And what an introduction. What an incredible introduction to the book it was. It actually was better than any, sometimes you have, nowadays I've noticed that some poetry books have trailers, advertising them. This is way better than that, because it's a very deeply thought out description of how Zeina Hashem sees the work of Hashem Beck. And I was immediately on board. I'll read, she begins, "There is no set language for poetry, as Lebanese poet Unsi El Hajj says. And there's no set language or ready meanings for Zeina." She goes on to say, "This honest and persistent emancipation from form and content is the fruit of free writing." I immediately really loved that. She says, "In this book, memory is open for imagination and interpretation." And then she says something that really, I fully loved. Even language isn't a safe place in Zeina's work. Readers will feel estranged from their received ideas about things, all the while wondrously belonging to the world that Zeina creates. And I have to say, I rushed to read the book, and I really did feel that those words from that introduction do pretty much perfectly describe the first section of the book. The book begins with a Ghazal. It's spelled Ghazal. It's a form of poetry. I will put a link below if you're interested in that, if you want further information. I am pronouncing it Ghazal, and I practiced it because that's how I heard Hashem Beck say that, and pronounce it in that way. And I'd like to pronounce it in the way that she does. I hope I did. And that is it's a form that I had heard about, but I actually really loved it here. I wasn't prepared for how much I would love the form. And then the first section starts. And I really did feel like I was entering a world that was familiar and yet completely strange to me. And I was enamored with it. It felt like I was perhaps, like someone who dives or maybe snorkels, and you're looking at this world beneath the surface of the water. And every once in a while you dive deeper and you feel that you are in it. And it is of this earth, but at the same time, it seems so unusual. The colors, the flavors, the attraction of different sights. And I'm very thankful to Zeina Hashem Beck for this. I have never quite experienced anything like that, and I loved it. I'm looking through my notes because I wrote copious notes, And I wrote about the fact that there's a yearning that's connected to love, that's connected to time and place. There's a sense of space or geography, and you realize, of course, that that it's referring to Lebanon a lot of the time. And of course you realize that the languages that are presented are Arabic and English, and perhaps a little bit of French as well. But there's also a sense that you're going beyond the expected dualities, that you have a speaker who's not necessarily exactly Zeina Hashem Beck, that there are imagination workings at play. I especially love the delicate introduction of certain images, such as balconies, the idea that you're both inside and outside, the idea that poets love balconies, the color blue, which is presented, I believe, very carefully as perhaps a shoelace, or even as a glimpse of an ocean, the question of whether that actually exists. I enjoyed the image of shoes, putting the shoes on, taking them off, fingers, toes, feet, hands. All of these seem to come into my vision in an entrancing way. And then there were the forms of the poems. Now, apart from the Ghazal, which I really thought was so well done, there are also several triptychs where you have 3 columns, which are sort of like 3 stanzas, and I wasn't sure whether to read them across or down. I looked up on YouTube whether Hashem Beck actually read any of these poems, and I found one that she read, and she read it across, but I think the beauty of it is that you can do either. Then after I read the first 2 sections, I also started thinking about O, that giant ring O. And recently I had listened to a video of a teacher who was talking about poetry. And this was just serendipity. They called the O, just O, not OH, the oratorical evocative O. And I really loved that idea. Obviously, it can mean many things to many different people. But I did feel that the use of the O, which is really done quite subtly at the beginning of the book, it gives the voice of the speaker this certain powerful energy and a type of radiating love, because it signals that here we're going to have what amounts to odes and sometimes feels like prayers of praise that float above a lot of the darker material of war, distress, the usual ups and downs of life, and a hinted at sexual trauma that's very, very below the surface thanks to very clever uses of form. I found the O was elevating it all, and I really enjoyed that. And apart from all of that, there's also definitely in the first section, and also in the second section, but not quite as much, there's a sprinkling of strangeness, of a sense that this world is just a little bit off, just a little bit weird. And it reminded me again of what I heard a teacher say once, which is any poem that is seriously good is weird. I didn't come up with that. I'm sure my teacher isn't the first one to have said that either. But any poem that is seriously good is weird. And I did certainly feel that there were certain moments in the first section of the book that made me realize that there's something deeper and more unusual beyond language that's happening. Then I have to say that with the third and fourth parts, I became less enamored with the poems. I felt that the direction of the reading and the energy of the reading was more biographical. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not as much to my taste as the first half of the book. I kept reading with curiosity and enjoyment most of the time because, frankly, I think that a lot of my enjoyment of poetry is the biographical details of the poets, because poetry is so intimate that even when you read the strangest poem, actually sometimes even more so when you read a strange poem, you get a very intimate, once in a lifetime window of opportunity to view how this poet sees themselves in the world, whether it's their personality, whether it's their family, friends, their society, the way they were, what they believe in, what they love, who they love. And of course, sometimes I do feel a bit guilty for doing that because it seems, sometimes I feel like I'm a voyeur when I'm looking up, biographies and intimate details. But when it's part of the poem, that's part of the attraction. Poets are celebrities to me, just as, actors or singers. And I enjoyed reading really about Zeina Hashem Beck's views about, having two daughters, having one daughter who was at hospital one time, having a daughter who had to check her blood, probably for diabetes, her hinting at her history with her husband and how there was disapproval within her family and the thought that this marriage might be a sin. There were details of friendships, of historical moments, remembering what she was like when she was young. Very personal details about how she sees her body, how she views her reproductive status, her friendships. It was fun and it was interesting to read this, and also within the context of having the speaker being so obviously Zeina Hashem Beck, and also bringing in the background of having grown up in Lebanon, having moved, I believe, to Dubai for several years, from what I could tell from a few names used in a couple of poems towards the end of the book. And then the experience of, she discusses New York and the similarities and differences between the cities and the countries, and missing home and feeling that you know the language and you don't know the language. And these are all themes that are really, they mean a lot to me. But at the same time, I felt that it dragged. It really did. And it didn't have the energy that the first half of the book did. And also in the use of form, I felt that let the book down a bit. Well, it let me down quite a lot. For example, the repetitions in the second half of the book are are huge. There's a lot of repetitive poetic structures, and it just pushed me over the edge, and it was too much for me. And it alienated me from some of the poems, actually. For example, I believe it was Morning Prayer that repeats thank you, thank you, thank you. There was a poem that I think was called Say Love, Say God. Within the one poem, there was a repetition of, I think, 2 stanzas, if I remember correctly, with just changing the word love to the word God. For me, it was very gimmicky, and I didn't really appreciate that at all. Then we had a poem called Things My Daughter Said, which listed really cute, interesting, and unusual phrases that the poet's daughter said. And some of the lines really do point to interesting themes and interesting uses of language. But it felt like it was, after the first half of the book, this didn't quite do it for me. And so I felt that it sort of peaked in the middle of the book and then ended on a disappointment for me. I think it's important, to be honest with oneself as a reader. I wanted to love the second half of the book so much more than I did. I almost forced myself to go beyond what I felt instinctively. But at the end of the day, you feel how you feel. So this has been such an exciting book for me to discuss, because it just came out, and it's this writer, this poet who's new to me, and I feel that it was time so well spent. If you do go and buy the book, and perhaps you'd like to buy the audio, I didn't purchase the audio, but I imagine that would be amazing, because Hashem Beck's reciting on YouTube is chef's kiss. So if you do, and you have similar or different experiences, please come back and comment, because I'd be very curious how other people see the book. It's just come out, so there aren't, there's not, as far as I know, reviews or things like that yet, but I'm sure there will be in the months to come. So on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your company. Please don't forget that the only real property is the property of the mind. And I'm hoping for the next few videos to discuss a little bit of prose, and also to get really stuck into the Forward Poetry Prize books. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.